Hello, it's Media Center Ukraine Odesa. We are continuing our briefings, and the following one will be about the security situation at the Black Sea. After Russia's exit from the grain treaty, the security situation at sea has obviously changed, and how it changed specifically, we are going to talk with Sidharth Kaushal, Research Fellow Sea Power Military Studies of the Royal United Services Institute from London. Sidharth is with us online. Hello, Sidharth.
Hello.
So what's your general view of the security situation at the Black Sea after the factual end of the grain treaty?
So in certain ways, there was an expectation that the situation would deteriorate for some time. Russia had been hinting at an exit from the grain deal. And so to an extent, commodity markets, for example, had adjusted to this reality. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been certain changes to the security situation following the explicit exit. Firstly, Russia's statement that it will treat vessels entering and exiting Ukrainian ports as hostile, and the possibility that it will engage in things such as mining in the northern Black Sea significantly increases the risks to shipping. But secondly, we've seen an intensification of Russia's air and missile campaign on land in support of its blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea ports, extending obviously to storage sites in Odesa, as you know, but also to areas on the Danube River. So broadly speaking, the situation has been deteriorating for some time, and it has deteriorated further as a result of Russia's explicit exit from the deal.
How do you see the situation with this mirror ban from Russian Federation stating that every vessel going to Ukrainian port is going to be considered enemy one for Russian Navy, and the declaration from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense banning the going of any vessels in the direction of Russian ports? Should we expect Russian government and Ukrainian Navy to really stop vessels or even hit vessels, or somehow trying to break these trade lines?
So I'll begin with Russia. I think that while it's certainly possible that they try to stop vessels in the northern Black Sea, it is perhaps less likely for two reasons. Firstly, ever since the sinking of the Moskva, Russia lost its primary air defense platform, with which protected smaller vessels in the northern Black Sea. And equally, the Ukrainian anti-ship cruise missile threat to Russian vessels has grown. So to actually operate within, say, 200 kilometers of the Ukrainian coast and interdict incoming foreign vessels, Russian ships would have to place themselves at some risk themselves. And that may be something that the Black Sea Fleet is less willing to do, especially because due to Article 19 of the Montreux Convention, they can't replace ships they lose in the Black Sea. Any vessel, vessels from Russia's other fleets, as you know, can't pass the Turkish Straits. The second reason is that explicitly boarding or sinking a vessel can create international ramifications for Russia. I think the less risky option for the Russians, and the option they seem to be taking, is twofold. Firstly, they seem to be seeding the northern Black Sea with mines, and they can do this in a clandestine way, for example, using their Kilo-class submarines, which can lay mines without direct attribution. The benefit for the Russians of doing this is, of course, the fact that if a vessel strikes a mine, it's not immediately attributable to the Russians, right? After all, in the initial days of the war, both Ukraine and Russia laid quite a lot of naval mines. Ukraine for defensive reasons, the Russians for more offensive ones. So there's an element of deniability there. The second element of the Russian approach seems to be destroying stockpiles on the ground. So as we saw with the cruise missile and drone strikes, as we mentioned on Odesa, but also on alternative routes, such as the Danube River route, which had been taking on a growing amount of capacity. So I think the Russians will become more aggressive in the northern Black Sea, but I suspect they'll probably try to avoid actually interdicting or sinking a foreign vessel, both because to do so puts their own naval platforms at risk from things like the Harpoon and the Neptune anti-ship cruise missile, and because of the international side of things. For the Ukrainian side, initially, of course, power projection at reach into some of the areas declared off limits to vessels may be difficult for the Ukrainian forces, given obviously they're operating under somewhat more constraints than the Russians are. Certainly, one could see a campaign of harassment with things like, uncrewed surface vessels, which Ukraine has used to good effect in attacks on, for example, Sevastopol. But I think the Ukrainian military would probably avoid that, both because diplomatically this could be consequential, and right now Russia is or should be bearing the burden for some of the food difficulties being endured, and also for practical military reasons, projecting power at reach is at sea at least is a little bit harder for the Ukrainian side. So so that's how I'd see both sides sort of executing or acting on what they've said so far.
I understand you, thanks. But I remember that since 2014, many ship owners, well, some ship owners and some companies used ships to go to the Russian and to Crimean seaports, using these ships to export goods, and de facto breaking sanctions which were laid down on Russia for occupying Crimea. So maybe somehow Ukrainian side could break this intention to use fleet under the flag of Liberia, for example, any third country, any flag country, as I understand. Is it possible for Ukrainian Navy to stop this this breaking of sanctions, actually?
Yeah, so I think there's two elements to your question. The one is the military side of things. So, of course, because Ukraine lost a lot of its fleet in the early days of the war, its ability to actually police routes of access into sort of ports in and around, let's say, Crimea, or some of the sanctions busting, gray vessels you described near Russian ports, is limited. It could use other tools, for example, to disrupt these ports. For example, long-range cruise missile strikes, perhaps, especially if Ukrainian ground forces continue to advance, and therefore increase the range from which, or rather decrease the range from which, air-launched cruise missiles can be fired at Russian ports like Sevastopol. It could also do things like use uncrewed surface vessels to target certainly maybe military targets in and around these ports, which, even if it didn't directly impact commercial shipping, would probably impact things like insurance, at least for those vessels that are declared that are not entirely gray. So there are ways in which Ukraine could potentially increase the pressure on these ports. But I think actually the major weapon against illegal shipping that's been, as you said, evading sanctions and in some cases re-exporting things like grain illegally from Russian ports is actually naming vessels, because the more intelligence available to the international community on the identities of these vessels and what the ownership structures are, the more pressure there is on the countries within which they're based to take action. So in some ways, actually, the most potent weapon against sanctions busting is the intelligence side of things rather than the naval side of things.
And my last question before I give the mic to the floor for them to ask you questions. You mentioned the insurance. Can you enlighten us? What's the situation with maritime insurance at that moment? I mean, since the start and since the end of the grain treaty, are these vessels being insured, and what's going to be with the maritime insurance now?
So at the very start of the war, additional insurance for vessels going in and out of the northern Black Sea was very difficult to secure. And moreover, reinsuring was highly costly, and premiums have remained very high throughout the conflict. We saw a slight dip in this as a consequence of the grain deal, and now it remains to be seen how insurance companies will react to the end of the deal. Most of them are still reassessing their positions. My expectation would be that there should presumably be a rise in, at a minimum, a rise in insurance premiums, and possibly questions raised about whether additional insurance is extended to vessels. The major, I think, the major policy question for both Ukraine and the countries backing it would be how some of that risk could be mitigated. So to insurers, that is, and to vessels. So Ukraine, of course, has set up a $500 million fund, dollar fund that provides some coverage for damages for vessels exiting Black Sea ports. There are potentially ways in which Ukrainian partners could augment those efforts, and I think that will be necessary in order to maintain things like relatively stable prices, because it's more likely than not that we'll see a quite considerable spike in insurance rates.
Thanks. So the first question, the mic, please.
Sir, thank you very much. Is it working?
Yeah. Please introduce yourself and go with the question.
Lorenzo Cremonesi for the Italian daily Corriere della Sera. Very interesting. Thank you to be with us. Sir, I have two questions. I will ask the first one. The effect of the Russian attacks yesterday on the two Danube harbors, Ismail and what is the name of the other? Rivne? What? Rini. And the other little harbor. Are they, first of all, what is your evaluation? Where this harbor, which Ukraine developed in the last months, is important? And how effective was this bombing? What are the consequences? Also because yesterday we were talking with the governor, and he told us the Russian already is patrolling the Danube delta. So in effect, these harbors are not so useful for Ukraine. Can you assess what happened there? Thank you.
Sure. So the volumes of trade being conducted on the Danube River by Ukraine had increased quite substantially over the past year as vessels were looking for alternative routes of egress from alternatives to some of the ports on the Black Sea that were under considerable risk. So we've seen an increase from 500,000 tons of goods to almost 2 million last year. So it was providing an alternative backdoor with which Ukraine could reach at least some of its markets, or potentially routes for transshipment and export via other avenues. And so it is actually somewhat consequential that those harbors on the Danube were struck. It challenges one of the back doors, so to speak, to the export of Ukrainian goods. There's another consequential factor, however, which is the proximity of those harbors to NATO territory, and the fact that the Russians are striking them does, of course, raise some risks of, for example, a stray missile, hitting the wrong side of the border. So I'd say it's consequential both for the situation regarding Ukrainian exports, but also it potentially has some broader geopolitical risks.
And you're to the mic, please.
Sir, and the second question is, I would like to understand a little more. We know that there is no practically Ukrainian navy. They don't use a navy. So the Russians are very effective in closing the sea from last year. Ukrainian ships are not moving, in effect. But this Zelensky threat, which you already mentioned, to attack any ship, which is going to the Russian harbor. If I listen to you, you say it's more demonstrative, it's more kind of a declaration that, it cannot really be implemented. Or it is, like, I don't know, by missile. You mentioned the Moskva, which was destroyed by an Ukrainian-made missile. They can try to do that, and how effectively? Thank you.
Yes. So in principle, you don't necessarily need ships in order to make transit very risky for vessels. As you mentioned, missiles represent one avenue, especially when vessels are actually in Russian harbors, and therefore they represent a static target. They can be hit with missiles or drones. We've also seen the Ukrainian Navy use uncrewed surface vessels, essentially unmanned boats, quite creatively against the Black Sea Fleet, both in Sevastopol and then against the intelligence gathering vessel Ivan Kerch near the Bosporus. So, you could see attacks on vessels in harbors conducted with those tools as well. So, in print, and there are examples elsewhere in the world of countries without really big navies still posing a credible threat to shipping. We might think of Iran, how the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps poses a real threat in the Straits of Hormuz to shipping with things like drones, missiles, mines, and all the rest. So I think there are potentially military ways in which the Ukrainians could sort of challenge freedom of access for vessels using Russian ports. There is a question, obviously, of how much effort that would take and how much resource that draws from other parts of the front line, as well as the broader sort of international considerations that to be borne in mind. But I don't necessarily think it's a paper threat. I think even without ships, that there are ways in which the Ukrainians could challenge Russian freedom of action. And that of vessels entering Russian
Thank you.
ports.
Just a follow-up to your answer. But since Zelensky declared that Ukraine also was able to attack ships going to the Russian harbor, did you see any diminishing activities? I mean, are the Russians reducing the traffic to their own harbor in the Black Sea or not?
I haven't necessarily seen any patterns or of any major changes in the patterns of shipping to Russian harbors so far. I mean, of course, the fact that, Sevastopol has been an active conflict zone for some time now, has meant that there has been an impact there. In other Russian Black Sea ports, as well as those in Russian occupied territory, thinking obviously of Russia's own ports like Novorossiysk, but also the ports they occupy within Ukraine along the Azov coast. I've not seen any evidence so far that there's been a change in patterns of shipping. It could well be that this becomes the case, although the Russians do have one advantage in this space, which is because some of the shipping they're relying on is gray shipping, which is already, so to speak, off the books. Things like spikes in insurance rates may not impact them as much in all instances. That being said, not all Russian shipping is gray. A lot of it does rely on international insurance markets. And so it's entirely plausible that we will see this effect over the medium term.
Yeah, the next question, please.
Доброго дня, мене звати.
Good afternoon. My name is Irina Nazarchuk. I have the following question to you. And I think it's rather surprising that the world failed to articulate some joint position for the first statement of the Russia, the first ultimatum, because now we see that Russia wants to affect the freedom of navigation in the sea. The legal status is that it is not solely owned by Ukraine or Russia, but it is owned by all Black Sea states. And now what we see, the Russian Federation not only militarizes the Black Sea, but it privatizes the Black Sea. So it makes the Black Sea its ownership. So now we can speak about the violation of the key principle of the maritime law. What should be the world response, the international community to such activities?
No, that's a very good question. And you're very right that Russia effectively enforcing quite an open-ended blockade of the Black Sea, of the northern Black Sea, does represent a quite considerable challenge to freedom of navigation. Though it is within the boundaries of international law for combatants to impose blockades on each other. There are some pretty stringent rules about what can be done to vessels, especially on international waters. There's two halves to that question, right? What I think should be done and what I think is likely to be done. So obviously, from a normative standpoint, the ability of a nation to close off a considerable body of water is something that should be met by the international community with consequences within the boundaries of what can be reasonably achieved. And maybe that's, something like sanctions or a further reduction on the price cap of Russian oil represent the sort of punitive measures one might think of. I think there's also a broader question, right, of Russia weaponizing hunger in fragile states all around the world, which one would think should receive broad international condemnation. In practical terms, however, I think this will be challenging for two reasons. On the subject of weaponizing hunger, Russia has argued, and not without some success in some quarters of the world, that that sanctions imposed on it have been just as deleterious and have been just as damaging in terms of food security in the developing world and have prevented it exporting things like grain and fertilizer. So I think this has mixed the messaging, particularly in parts of the developing world where you would think there would be more direct condemnation of Russia and therefore a stronger political basis to act against it. In terms of consequences, direct efforts to support freedom of navigation, the question is how one gets around the Russian blockade, which if it's primarily enforced with mines rather than ships, the primary question would be how many nations can generate the requisite amount of minesweepers to act on, to clear channels through Ukraine's ports and essentially dare Russia to act against the naval vessels of another state. Now, it's very difficult for non-Black Sea states to do this because obviously the Montreux Convention limits how much tonnage they can have in the Black Sea. It's also difficult to gift Ukraine minesweepers because although it's been done, the UK has done so for Ukraine with the Sandown class minesweepers because Article 19 of Montreux remains in force, actually getting them through the straits to Ukraine is difficult. Obviously, states that are Black Sea states, countries like Turkey, which has quite a lot of minesweepers itself, could bear the risk, but obviously they would be doing so at some diplomatic and obviously military risk to their own assets. And so I see that as potentially unlikely as well. A third sort of area, obviously, is the imposition of additional punitive sanctions. Not all Russian banks have been excluded from SWIFT, for example, or that could be expanded, or price caps obviously could be pushed lower. But I think there are some key interests economically which might make a consensus on that within Europe difficult to achieve in all instances. And one other area, I should say, in which some of the challenges posed by Russia could be mitigated, and this may be a quick win on which everyone can agree, is actually just the provision of more air defenses for Ukraine's ports on the Danube or grain storage sites in Odesa, for example. So I think, broadly speaking, in terms of what I think should be done, there's a range of things that I would like to see. But in terms of where consensus is likely to emerge, I suspect that we might have to start a bit small and maybe just things like improving the air defenses so that grain cannot be destroyed on site, or attributing efforts at clandestine mining to make it harder for Russia to do in a deniable way might be sort of early first steps the international community might take.
The next question, please. Introduce yourself and state your question.
I'm a journalist from Portugal, and I'm writing for the main newspaper there. You mentioned Turkey, and right now we know that Ukrainian vessels are not leaving the port and the grain is staying inside Ukraine. Do you think Turkey, in a de facto action, can actually help Ukraine to to travel with the ships out of the Black Sea to export this grain, or is just words and diplomacy, and in reality nothing is going to happen? And if it does happen, what if one of these ships gets targeted or some damage by one of these mines because it's a NATO country? What can happen?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So materially, Turkey probably does have the capacity to abet vessels trying to leave Ukraine because it has a fairly considerable minesweeping capability, as well as arguably the Black Sea's strongest regional fleet. I think there's two elements of risk, though, and you hit on one of them, which is the risk of a vessel being damaged. And it's even more complex when if the vessel is damaged by a mine, because actually targeting the vessels of a NATO state with a missile or one of their own ships, I think is something Russia would be very loath to do. I think the Russian leadership understands the consequences. But, if we think back to previous historical events, the Iran-Iraq tanker war in the 1980s, for example, we saw a lot of instances in which drifting mines damaged vessels, naval platforms at sea, sometimes unintentionally, right? You remember the case of the Iranian mine, which damaged an American naval vessel, and this precipitated a lot of military consequences for Iran. That wasn't something the Iranians intended. The events escaped their control. So the risk for the Turks, I think, is once the Russians have laid these mines, almost irrespective of Russian intent, there's a risk of damage to vessels, and then they're faced with a quite risky conundrum. Do you simply accept your naval vessel has been damaged and don't attribute, in which case, you've suffered a diplomatic and a military cost, or do you attribute it to Russia, in which case you put yourself on an escalatory pathway because now this is a direct attack on a NATO vessel by a Russian asset. So I think there are some real limitations in terms of how much risk the Turkish would be willing to internalize, even though they potentially have the capabilities. The other dimension of this, of course, is that the Turkish leadership was until quite recently expressing its hope that some form of renewal of the Black Sea grain deal could be achieved. The diplomatic situation in which Turkey's placed itself, where it's an important supporter of Ukraine, but also maintains open conversation or open lines of communication with Russia is an advantageous one for Turkey, especially given that Turkish and Russian interests overlap, and they find themselves operating quite close to each other in other parts of the world as well. Thinking of places like the Middle East, Syria, or North Africa. So a stable relationship with Russia is also in Turkey's broader diplomatic interests, and that I think probably will limit some of the risk the Turkish are willing to bear on this subject as well. So I think, yeah, you're right, that even though the capabilities exist for both the reasons of worrying about military escalation if, say, a mine hits a vessel, but also broader diplomatic concerns, that might not materialize.
Thank you, Dr. Sidharth. Thank you for the analysis and your thoughts about the security situation in the Black Sea. We have to finish the briefing we are going to have next in just a few minutes. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you here again, online or offline, if you decide to visit Ukraine, to visit Odesa. Thank you.
I look forward to it, and thank you very much for having me.
Thanks. And our next briefing is going to be in just a few minutes. It's going to be about agricultural situation in the southern Ukraine, especially in Odesa region. Stay with us, and it's going to be interesting.